Hello, today from Joyful Christian Hermit, and I'm going to cover actually a hermit in this video because I want time to really pray and think and jot down an outline, do more focus on the topic of suffering and the phases of it, what we go through, what we can go through. But I did notice this. I wanted to show these vomit things when you're nauseated. And I, think that people who really truly have nausea are sick with it and throw up violently even. I realized that this lady who has a site and was infatuated with what I write and say, and other people report to her, what I'm talking about, but was so nauseated, she said, by Jesus telling me that he loved me because I was so pathetic. So, and that nauseated this person, and that brought up to my mind what I use when I get horribly ill with these gut attacks that I get from my arachnoiditis. And so I keep one of these by the bed. I think you can probably get them on Amazon. I had so many trips to the emergency room at a couple of different hospitals a year ago, this time period, fall and into January, February, for my gut attacks and my kidney failure, that I got several of these. And then you just put it up to your mouth, and if you're nauseated, and throw up into this. And it's strong. I used grocery bags. Always used to have a grocery bag here by the bed if I would get into a gut attack and need to use it. And they can have a little hole in it that you don't even see. And then you've got a mess, getting to the bathroom with this bag that's dripping. So sorry to be graphic, but it's a reality with people who have genuine nausea, who are actually throwing up for serious reasons. Not being facetious, but granted, it was humorous. And I hadn't looked for about 6 weeks, and then to see if it's not something from the past the person wrote, then it's tends to be something about my stuff, what I talk about, and how I'm wrong, and this and that. And I used to be bothered by it, but now I realize it's really an honor that someone is that interested in what I talk about. So today, I'm talking about Paul of Thebes. He's also known as the First Hermit. And I admire him a great deal. He lived approximately 227 to 341. He lived a long life. He's known as Paul the First Hermit, Paul the Anchorite, was an Egyptian saint, regarded as the first Christian hermit, and grazer. Now, I love doing this. It's a blessing that this is another thing for when we're talking about being, get my thing to work, disabled and sick or in pain a lot. Just what we can learn and appreciate. And if we think, so a grazer, I thought, well, what's a grazer? And so I looked that up then. I won't take a long time on it, but there's so much on it, I think I'll probably do a video on grazers. And the idea of how radical hermits were, and how in our time period, if you aren't just what, the in crowd, I guess you would call it, thinks, people think a hermit ought to be, but based mostly on medieval times. But if we did what these early Christian hermits did, oh my, people would be, we would be out of favor as hermits. But it just goes to show that, we are free to do as God calls us, as the Spirit moves us, as Jesus teaches and allows. And so here's what grazers were. Get a little bit bigger here. They were a category of hermits and anchorites, men and women in Christianity that developed in the first millennium of the Christian era, mainly in the Christian East, but not totally, but in Syria, Palestine, Pontus, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. However, the majority of them were situated in Palestine and Syria. They derived their name from their practices, which consisted of nourishing themselves only with raw plants, often eating on all fours, and living in a wild manner among the beasts. They were dressed in clothes made exclusively from leaves and vegetation, or simply went completely naked. Furthermore, they did not cultivate plants, they didn't grow plants, they did not use fire. They were linked to another type of hermits called the dendrites, which seemed to have the same way of living but lived in trees. The grazers may be perhaps among the inspirations for the wild man archetype, a legendary figure in medieval Egypt. Where hermits were more wild men, and I'll show you this photo again, but here's a artistic rendering, I think from the 1600s, of St. Paul the First Hermit. But note that he's wearing an animal fur, or a skin, around his loins, otherwise naked. But in reality, he wore palm leaves covering himself or went naked. So there's just so much more about these grazers. But, in our time, even just with eating, with diet, we have, we go through trends, where people then just are, I was vegetarian for a long time and would grow vegetables, a way to save money. I didn't eat meat at all. It's more expensive. And I only started eating meat, like especially red meat or hamburger, because one of the viewers told me how eating a heavy meat diet, carnivore diet, for her straightened out her intestines. So I don't eat that totally, but I now, and my protein was very low. I'm very anemic. It's probably why I can't get well that quickly on things. But I will get hamburger at Costco, and I'll often have a hamburger in the morning, and or vary it with oatmeal and then hamburger. But then maybe I just have a little fruit in late afternoon and a vegetable for supper. So, we got into this thing of, I think maybe 20 or 30 years ago, it started. Definitely within the last 20 years of, find out what your ancestors were and then eat accordingly. If they were grazing, and then they talked about grains and things. And then if they were in vegetables, and then if they were more of not the gathering type, but the eating type, killing other animals for their food, killing animals, we were derived from those and eat that kind of food. And it got into that kind of a trend, people did. The paleo diet developed then. And so we do the same thing, but in the church with hermits now, it's interesting to see the where it's moving with these diocese hermits. Not at all like the first 2,000 years of Christian hermits, and especially not the first few centuries, where several centuries, up until the Middle Ages, but they were very free. I thought they originally wore these, long robes. That was the dress of the poor. but in flax. They would use flax, which was a light color. It didn't absorb the heat of the desert, but also it was the least expensive fabric, as opposed to wool, so or linen. So, but no, before that, they were even more simple and just truly lived very basically and eating on all fours. Now, with my knee, I couldn't do that now. It's very hard to be on my knee. But actually, standing, that's hard on my back. But for me, laying down to eat is not your best way. But I prop up. But since I don't sit, but being on all fours before my knee was, but that would have been okay. Because my arms are actually rather long and I would be more upright then. Like an ape, maybe. Eat like an ape. But I mean, can you imagine what people would think, if my being pathetic and God loving me because I was pathetic causes someone to be sick to their stomach. Think what would happen if I ate on all fours. But it was accepted back then. And I'm wondering if people who didn't then were looked upon as frauds if they didn't do as the early hermits did then. So it's style, it's what gets established and what gets in the minds of other people of what a hermit ought to be like. We need to be asking God what he wants. And that's how I found out early on that I'm in a religious order, God's order of the present moment. And he wants me just to wear what I happen to have in that moment. That's my habit. And so, and I'm not sure, but that day was St. Joseph's feast day. I wanted to know who the patron saint was of the order of the present moment. And he said St. Joseph. Well, it was St. Joseph's Day, 19th of March, when I had this vision and this conversation going on. But maybe it's whatever saint of whatever day, or many saints. But I could see a rationale why St. Joseph could be always, because he obeyed God in whatever present moment. Radically, he obeyed. He was to take Mary into his house through a dream, I think that was. Or no, a locution. And then an angel told him. Then getting up, leaving in the night to Egypt, boom, he had a dream telling him to do that. And he obeyed, radical. Right then and there in the present moment. Up they got little baby Jesus. He was maybe 2 at that time, I think. 18 months to 2 years old, and packed up and off they went. Took very few things and got out of there from a warning. That's trust. It took me a year to finally follow through, a year of nightly dreams, to trust and to know that God really meant it. I needed to leave California and get back to my hometown. I'd even had it the year before, and then had so many threats from the ex-husband that I thought it's not worth going through that with him. And then I didn't have enough money for a lawyer. So finally, when I had enough money to get a lawyer, the following year I did it, and it was miraculous. So, but I looked at the faith of Joseph and obeying and listening to these locutions and dreams, and other saints too. Great faith. So Paul was a grazer, and he was claimed to have lived alone in the desert of Thebes in Roman Egypt from the age of 16 to the age of 113 years old. He was canonized in 491 by Pope Gelasius I and is venerated as a saint by the Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Oriental Orthodox churches. So there, I would sort of like to look up this Pope Gelasius too. So if you're disabled and not sure what to do, it does take your mind off the suffering, and we learn a great deal. And these people that we get to know are with us, like Paul, his spirit, talking about him, sharing with you about his life. You know he's here and appreciating what we're learning about his life so that we can be inspired in our lives, whether we're full hermits, consecrated hermits, diocese hermits, or if we privately consecrated and consecrated by God, or if we have hermit at heart, or everyone has bit of hermit in them, or should cultivate that, to have time of quiet and solitude for time with God. And even children can be taught that. It's good. So the life of St. Paul the First Hermit was written in Latin by Jerome, probably in 375 to 376. Oh, here's my phone doing this again. Okay. So he was, as I said, born around 227 in Thebes of Egypt. He and his married sister lost their parents. So in order to obtain his inheritance, his brother-in-law decided he was going to betray Paul to the persecutors, because Paul was Christian. So his sister's husband was going to do this in order to get the inheritance away from Paul, because it went to the son. But his sister was married, so she was being taken care of, but still evil, greed. Got to the brother-in-law. According to Jerome's Vita on Paul, Paul fled to the Theban desert as a young man, they think around age 16, during the persecution of Decius and Valerianus, around AD 250. See, they'd be interesting to find out more about that persecution too. And just to know, the little persecutions I've had are nothing into comparison. I should have been learning about them years ago, and I wouldn't have reacted or been so upset. All these others would have, I would have called upon them, and they would have bolstered me more. So we limit ourselves, I think. I do anyway, with all of the help that's available. Of course, God and Jesus and Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary, the Trinity's always there for us. But all these other people, my mom and dad helped me a lot from the other side and still do. He lived in the mountains of this desert in a cave near a clear spring and a palm tree, the leaves of which provided him with clothing and the fruit of which provided him with the only source of food until he was 43 years old, when a raven started bringing him half a loaf of bread daily. Would fly in with his half loaf of bread. Miraculous, yes. He remained in that cave for the rest of his life, he remained in that cave. He lived in it for about 100 years. Not quite. 97 years, technically. So Paul of Thebes, or Paul the First Hermit, is known to posterity because around the year 342, Anthony the Great was told in a dream about the older hermit's existence and went out to find him. Now, Anthony the Great is also 4th century hermit. There are other Anthonys who are hermits. But this Anthony the Great, his feast day is in 2 days, on January 17th. So I'm going to be talking about him then, hopefully, because I think it's, for any of us, it's good to know about these great hermit lives. Their total renunciation of the world is something that even hermits of today can't legitimately do, can't legally do. We can't just go off and find a cave. Somebody would own it and kick us out, unless we could stay hidden, but we couldn't stay hidden for long. And going around in woods and finding food, possibly we have ailments now in our time that go around, or ailments that have developed through possibly the weakening of bodies, such as shingles or I don't know what all, but things that we would, in our suffering, know, well, there's an antibiotic that would help me. And we would want it, because we'd been brought up with these things and wouldn't want to suffer it out or end up having worse infection. So they were maybe hardier stock, used to the rough and difficult times more. People in general back then, but I'm sure the mortality rate was very high with different plagues and different ailments and also. So that's though how Anthony the Great discovered Paul. Otherwise, we wouldn't have ever known about Paul. He kept hidden. He kept hidden totally. No one knew of him. He had disappeared. He never did go back to get his inheritance. Because I read elsewhere, he found great solace and joy in his time with God and the conversations he would have with God and the love of God, and was totally content and at peace with his status. So he realized, when the persecutions were over, I'm not going back to that way of life. He had found purity of the soul, I think we could say. A direct and meaningful life in God. That's another tip for people with disabilities, is finding that meaningful love connection, friendship all the time, 100% with God. And then our life is meaningful no matter what it is, no matter what condition. So they met when actually Paul was 113 then. They conversed with each other for 1 day and 1 night. This is according to Jerome in his relating this story that came from Anthony. Each of the saints are shown inviting the other to bless and break the bread as a token of honor. Now, I had also read elsewhere that when Anthony came and found his cave, found Paul's cave, for the first time ever, Paul remarked, the raven came but brought a full loaf of bread, since there were 2 of them. It was miraculous, obviously. The whole thing with the raven bringing the half a loaf all those years to Paul. But then when Anthony came, the raven brought a full loaf of bread. And it is said here that Paul held one side, putting the other side into the hands of Anthony. And soon the bread broke through the middle, and each took his part. When Anthony next visited him, Paul was dead. Anthony clothed him in a tunic which was a present from Athanasius of Alexandria, and buried him with 2 lions helping to dig the grave. Father Anthony, as he was called, he wasn't a priest, but wise elders, men, were called fathers back then, as was in the Old Testament, Father Abraham. Any wise elder, and even on through the ages, people would tend to call them father if they were wise and older men. So he returned to his monastery, taking with him the robe from Athanasius woven with palm leaf. He honored the robe so much that he only wore it twice a year, the Feast of Easter and at Pentecost. So I had read in another spot that Paul recognized when Anthony was there, shortly after they met, that he was dying, and he asked he asked Anthony to bear to put that cloak on him, the one that Athanasius. Mercy, please stop barking. So Athanasius was very revered hermit, also, a theologian of the time period. That's what he was, a theologian. He actually wrote the biography of Anthony. Athanasius did. That's our record of Anthony, then, is by Athanasius. Athanasius the Great, he's called. So, but this, I think I tend to believe this version. I can't imagine Paul asking for that robe of Athanasius. Very special indeed. I think his humility would have kept him from it. So I trust this version more for that reason, that he wouldn't have been bold and asked for it. But I could see that Anthony would remove it after he had put it on him and he died, or he put it on him, that he removed it to take him after he buried him naked. Because Paul lived basically naked except for palm leaves around his loin area, for modesty. But it also, another one also said he would go naked at times too. No one ever saw him but Anthony, ever. It's amazing, isn't it? Except from age 16 on, that is. So his feast day is 15th of January, which is in the liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church. And in the 2004 edition of the Roman Martyrology, it's listed as 10th of January. Eastern Orthodox churches celebrated on the 15th, and also the 9th of February in the Coptic Church, which is, the Coptics are mostly in Egypt, and they broke away from the Catholic Church really early on. I was surprised. I didn't realize that. I thought it was only until the Great Schism that there was breakaway, but then I found out maybe a year ago that the Coptics had, much earlier, maybe in the 3rd or 4th century. It was in an argument over the Virgin Mary and her role, basically her role. Leave it at that for now. So Anthony described Paul as the first monk. So the monastery of St. Paul the Anchorite is Lovey, I'm not going to do it now. I'm not petting you now. Sit. Good boy. Traditionally believed by the Coptics in Egypt to be on the site of the cave where Paul lived and where his remains are kept. The monastery is located in the eastern desert mountains of Egypt, near the Red Sea. The cave church of St. Paul marks the spot where Anthony and Paul are believed to have met. So there is a monastery there on this site. The Order of St. Paul, the First Hermit, was founded in Hungary in honor in the 13th century. This would be the 1200s, medieval time, mid-medieval. He is usually represented with a palm tree, 2 lions, and a raven. He is also the patron saint of the Roman Catholic Diocese of San Pablo and titular of the Cathedral of the said diocese in San Pablo, Laguna, Philippines. So here's some artwork. This one is a sketch. I think it's from Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. Anthony the Great visits Paul of Thebes. See if I can get it out of the window light. There, get it straightened out. I'm directionally challenged. There it is. Early artwork. Anthony and Paul meeting. There was the palm tree there. There's some ravens up on top. Here is St. Anthony the Great and St. Paul, the Anchorite. He's called either way, by Diego Velázquez in 1634. Looks like oil paint. And then this one. This one's from 1640, St. Paul the First Hermit, by Giuseppe Ribera, and it's in the Museo del Prado in Spain, I think that is. And this is the one that I'm more familiar with him. I'm trying to find a spot where my window reflection isn't so bad. Straighten it out. No, not doing well with the window. And he's meditating on death. He has a skull there. That's always been typical. And yeah, the raven's up above him. But he has, well, as I look at that, it doesn't look like fur after all. It looks like a dead brown, old palms. I see their little leaves, their needles. I suppose they would be considered needles or leaves, the little prongs that come out. Like linobarium, like Japanese maples that are linobariums that have the fine little finger leaves, different type of leaf. And palms have that type of leaf. So, but the skull and that I think is more of a medieval thing that hermits would do. Santa Rosalia was found with a skull. Meditating on death was, they would literally have a skull with them to look at it, to realize this is me. It's going to be me. And on a documentary of Mount Athos, they have a place where they have the bones of lots of the monks that died there over the centuries. And it was row after row of skulls, just skulls on shelving, like shelving. It was amazing, So, so I think, let me see. I think I had. Did I have something I wanted to read? Of. No, it's not that one. Maybe I didn't get it. I was going to read. But I won't. I'll do it another time. It was what St. Julian of Norwich wrote for today. It's not specifically involving St. Paul the Hermit, but she was an Anchorite in England in the Middle Ages. Sort of early or mid-Middle Ages, 13th century, I think, so 1200s. And had quite an experience of an illness, a terrible illness. And she had many visions during that illness that she wrote down. And so those are her showings. She called them her showings. And they're in that Classics of Western Spirituality has a book on her with her showings all written, translated by authentic translator, excellent translators. So it makes a difference, translations does, in all of this. But so I think I trust Jerome's biography of Paul of Thebes. I'm sure it's been translated from the Latin and may be hard to get. I don't know. I've not had a copy of that. And didn't particularly look for one. It might even be online now or excerpts from it. Who knows? But since he got it directly from Anthony, who visited, and as the only human being who ever saw Paul. So I think just knowing about their lives gives us consecrated hermits gives us all who are in part hermit or adopting aspects of hermit life just in little bits. The frugality, the simplicity, the detachment from temporal desires, and also getting he had onslaughts of the devil, earlier on, and even later. The devil will always attack those who are going against the world and living a life more dedicated to God, increasingly so. The devil will keep trying to pull us away from that and place doubts in our minds, or try to, in our emotions mostly, our senses, our memories, our images, imagination in our dreams and things. So, but also in daily life with situations. After all, the devil's an angel, a dark angel, and has a lot of, we're lower than the angels, has a lot more abilities. And God allows the dark angels to tempt us. It strengthens our faith. We know what kind of metal of which we're made, what choices we're going to make, and we fall, and we learn to get up and to move on then, and to not wallow in the errors we've made. I've had to learn that it's a sign of pride if we are too blown away by our mistakes, that we can't get over it. That's pride, clinging, that we thought we were that great, that how could we possibly fall? Oh, we gotta watch all that pride stuff, because the devil delights in that for sure and gets us on it. Because then if we're thinking about all that, then we aren't moving on with God and love and goodness and truth. We're stuck, and we're not in the present moment. We're stuck in the past of what we had done and beat ourselves up over it continuously. We can in our minds, or just subconsciously even. It can become a habitual sadness. That's another thing about a life that was in the world and healthy and capable and viable in the temporal world, to suddenly not being in that world. We must do what we can to make that transition. It's a metamorphosis, and we must not assume that it's not better. I have found it's better than what I was in the other world, the world of the temporal, and interacting and with other people in the temporal and situations, and more difficult really in the other world in many ways. You find out there's many joys and gifts and blessings, and just the ability of prayer. Pain praying is a joy and a gift, and drawing close to God. That's why Paul didn't want to go back. He was content. 97 years he was in that cave. And of course, my life isn't nearly like that. But I think there's some hermits out there who are, and they wouldn't be online sharing their lives either. But it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It means they're far more austere, though. And I'm assuming, in some ways, have probably a great closeness to God, even succumbing and getting these 2 dogs, which was a medical need, to force me up, to keep me going, because I could no longer use my mind over matter. My mind could not get me up in the morning with the pain as it kept getting worse and worse. My mind did not have that strength anymore. And so it was humbling. So we go with the flow, go with God's flow. God bless you all. Talk to you at another time. And how interesting it all is, isn't it? The religious life, people who loved God and lived for God all through time. This is what a blessing to find out about them and to choose our lives, according to God's will, but to move on and by God's grace. Have a beautiful day or night and night.